Hello and welcome to this current history podcast. Now, this one is going to look at how the League of Nations kept peace. So we've looked at their structure and how they were organised and their aims and then who was involved in the membership side. But now we're going to actually look at how they kept peace. So how did they try and enforce their aim? And their first aim was to keep the peace. And the best place to start is by looking at these three different ways that they kept the peace. And the first way was that they would condemn a country that was in the wrong. So if a country was threatening another one or was doing something that the League of Nations didn't agree with, the first thing the League of Nations would do was tell the country it was doing wrong, to, in a sense, waggle its finger at it and say, stop what you're doing, what you were doing is morally and unethically wrong. Now, if condemning the country didn't work, what they'd then do is offer some kind of arbitration. So the quarrel could be between two countries, so they'd offer to decide between the two countries. And we'll see in future podcasts that there were some countries that had quarrels with each other, and the League of Nations offered to step in and sort these quarrels out. And then if arbitration wouldn't work, well, it might be that the League of Nations would have to enforce sanctions, which stopped trade with those countries. And obviously the idea was, well, if you're going to carry on what you're doing, we're going to stop all the countries in the League of Nations because we're a joined unit, like we said in previous podcasts, as Justice League unit looking out for each other. If you're going to continue to do something wrong, all these countries will stop trading with you. And obviously the country is in the wrong. It was thought, well, they're not going to want to lose trade because it affects them economically, and then obviously the people in the country get upset and want them to stop what they're doing. So, these were the three different ways. Condemning the country, they would use arbitration, and then they'd eventually use sanctions as well. And the whole basis of this idea, it's not threatening in a way. It doesn't use military force to enforce these. It's a very good use, well, some would say very unrealistic use of moral power. This idea that all these countries in the League of Nations are promising to keep the peace. There's no real threat behind what they're saying. So when they condemn a country, it's just waggling a finger. And if they're offering to arbitration, well, the country can simply refuse. And the sanctions aren't always perhaps going to work, which we're going to look at in a moment. But this whole idea that the League of Nations was acting on moral power. World War I has just finished. It was the worst war of all time. And this idea, look, if we don't want World War I to happen again, we need to work together. We need to be more civil. And we need to use a different way of dealing with problems. So we can't go to war. We need to use things like this. Condemning the country, arbitrating, and then using sanctions. And this is a very honourable thing to have. Okay? It's a very different way of approaching international conflict, which had not been seen before, and it is an honourable thing to do. But, as we can see from this cartoon up here, called Moral Persuasion, which was released in Punch in 1920, so when the League of Nations first started, it's called Moral Persuasion, and we've got a picture of the rabbit, who is supposed to be representing the League of Nations, and then we've got a snake, who is representing international strife. So even when the League of Nations started up, there's still a lot of people that think, can moral persuasion really work? Is it a realistic approach? Is it a realistic approach to keeping peace? And in this cartoon size, it really isn't, because we've got the rabbit here who is staring down the international strife. It's trying its best to persuade it to stop whatever it is doing. So, it could be some kind of war that the country is threatening, the snake is threatening, and the rabbit, all it can really do is stare back. And as it says in the cartoon, quote at the bottom up here, my offensive equipment being practically nil, it remains for me to fascinate him with the power of my eye. So the cartoonist is saying, look, they have no army, they have no military force, the League of Nations. All they can do to try and stop international strife and conflict is to simply talk to it, to stare it down, because that's the only way it can stop any international problems anymore. And the cartoonist is really asking, is that an effective approach? Because really, a snake easily overpowers a rabbit any day. And therefore, this cartoon is saying really that the League of Nations, although morally in the right, is in a way going to be easily overtaken by a much stronger threatening snake. And one of the reasons he thinks this, the cartoonist, is because the League of Nations doesn't have an army. It doesn't have a standing army of its own. Now, they could use military force, which is sometimes a misconception. People just assume because it doesn't have an army, it doesn't use any kind of military force. Well, they could use a military force, but the problem was that everyone, and I mean everyone, in the League of Nations had to agree. They'd have to send men from their own country to go and stop a conflict. So if there was a conflict somewhere, the League of Nations would have to agree to send men from their respective nations. Now, do we think that countries after World War I are realistically wanting to do that? Are they really going to want to get involved in some country somewhere that they may not actually have any kind of interest in whatsoever, or see it as a nowhere country that they don't really care about? Are they willing to send men to do that? And the answer is no, they weren't willing. And so in the end, even though there was this idea of using military force, was everyone really going to do that? Now, the problems that come about from this just moral power and condemning, arbitrating and sanctions is that when it comes to condemning a country, the country in the wrong could just ignore them. If someone's wagging a finger at you and says, stop what you're doing, the easiest thing, especially if you're a country, is just ignore that person who's wagging a finger at you. Just to, well, what are you going to do about it? Shrug your shoulders. And another problem with sanctions in particular is that we have to remember to previous podcasts, not all countries in the world were in the League of Nations. There were some and the many that were not involved at all. So if the League of Nations did apply some kind of sanctions, the countries who were in the wrong could still trade with non-members of the League of Nations. And so, yes, they might be dented by some kind of sanctions, but at the same time, a lot of countries had to agree to do those sanctions, and the countries who weren't even involved in the League of Nations wouldn't affect them anyway. So what to remember with how the League of Nations kept peace is that, yes, morally they were in the right, and they used this kind of moral superiority to try and persuade people not to go to war and to keep peace, and it's a very honourable thing to do. But the problem with it is that because they had no standing army of their own, they couldn't really threaten effectively. And as it shows in the cartoon, they come across as like a hare or a rabbit compared to international problems, which are more perceived as like a snake and much stronger and more powerful. And one of the problems was that countries could just ignore anything the League of Nations was saying, and this is something that crops up later on in the 1930s, which we'll be looking at in the future.